long before the first temple was built in her name, long before the poets carved her praises into stone, or the painters learned to reach for rose gold and sea foam on their palettes. She was already there. She was already there in the pull of the tide at golden hour, in the breathless pause between a glance and a smile, in the way a song, heard once across a crowded room, makes something deep inside you ache without knowing why. Her name was Aphrodite, and if you think you already know her, the beautiful goddess, the one who makes men foolish and women jealous, the divine figure draped loosely in myth and marble, then perhaps we might ask you, gently, to set that version aside for a moment, because the real Aphrodite is far stranger, far older, and far more powerful than most people ever realize. She was born, according to the oldest telling, not from a mother's womb, but from the sea itself. The story goes like this. The Titan Cronus, in the earliest and most violent age of the gods, took a sickle to his own father, Auranos, the sky, and cast the severed flesh into the ocean. And from that wound, from that meeting of divine blood and ancient water, the sea began to foam, white and churning and luminous. And from within that foam, Aphros in ancient Greek, she rose. She rose fully formed, an adult, already beautiful beyond description, already powerful beyond measure. She came ashore, the myth tells us, on the island of Cyprus, and as her bare feet touched the earth for the very first time, flowers bloomed in her footsteps. The air warmed, the birds began to sing, and the gods on Olympus, who had seen many wonders and had grown somewhat difficult to impress, they fell silent. That is who she was, from the very first moment of her existence. Not a goddess who earned her power, not one who climbed or fought or proved herself. She arrived into the world already sovereign, and the world simply rearranged itself around her. Now, people sometimes make the mistake of thinking Aphrodite was merely a goddess of romance, of weddings and valentines and soft, pretty things, and we understand why. That is, after all, the shape she has taken in the modern imagination, a gentle deity, pleasant and decorative, the divine equivalent of a love poem. But the ancient Greeks knew better. They understood that love, true love, desire in its full and uncontrollable form, was not soft at all. It was dangerous. It was disorienting. It was one of the most destabilizing forces in the known universe. And so the goddess who ruled over it was not a gentle figure. She was a force of nature. She was, in the truest sense of the word, a power. Her domain was vast. Before we continue, if these stories have become part of your nights, consider subscribing to the channel as we prepare another story for you. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the story. Yes, she governed romantic love and physical desire, but she also presided over beauty in all its forms, the beauty of the human body, of the natural world, of art and craftsmanship and adornment. She governed pleasure and the deep human need for it. She governed fertility. She governed the invisible architecture of attraction, the reason two people, out of all the people in all the world, turned toward each other. And she governed something darker too, obsession, longing, the madness that unrequited love produces, the destruction that passion left unchecked can leave in its wake. She was all of it, the light and the shadow, both. In terms of raw power, Aphrodite ranked among the 12 Olympians, the highest tier of Greek divinity. She sat at that table alongside Zeus, Poseidon, Athena, Apollo, and while she carried no spear, commanded no armies, and threw no thunderbolts, the ancient Greeks were absolutely clear. She was not the weakest among them. If anything, she was among the most feared, because what Ares could do to a city with 10,000 soldiers, Aphrodite could accomplish with a single whisper in the right ear. She could move kings. She could ruin heroes. She could redirect the course of history with nothing more than a golden apple and a promise. And she did, repeatedly. The Trojan War, perhaps the greatest catastrophe in all of Greek mythology. 10 years of bloodshed, the fall of an entire civilization, began because of her. A beauty contest, a bribe, a young prince named Paris, and a queen named Helen. All of it set in motion by Aphrodite, who simply decided to offer what no one else could, the most beautiful mortal woman in the world. Whether that was a gift or a curse is a question the Greeks never quite resolved. In the segments that follow, we will walk slowly and without hurry through the full story of this extraordinary deity. We will explore where she truly came from and why two very different origin myths managed to survive side by side for centuries. We will meet the mortals she loved and the ones she destroyed. We will follow her into the halls of Olympus, into the bedchambers of kings, onto the shores of Troy. We will look at how she was worshipped, feared, and negotiated with by the people who built their lives in her shadow. And perhaps, somewhere along the way, we will begin to understand why, of all the gods the ancient Greeks imagined into being, it was Aphrodite who proved, in the end, to be the one they could never fully control. She was not simply a goddess of beauty. She was beauty itself, ancient, untamable, and utterly indifferent to the damage it leaves behind. There is something unusual about Aphrodite that scholars noticed long ago, and that casual readers of Greek mythology tend to walk right past without pausing to consider. She has two origin stories, not a single myth with minor variations, the way most Greek gods do. Not a tale that shifted slightly from city to city, the way oral traditions naturally drift over centuries. Two distinct, fully formed, mutually contradictory accounts of how she came into being. And the ancient Greeks kept both of them, deliberately, side by side, without apparent discomfort. That alone should tell us something. That alone should make us slow down and look more carefully. Because when a culture refuses to choose between two versions of a story, it usually means that both versions are saying something true, something important, something the people who told them were not willing to lose. The first origin story is the one we touched on in our opening, the older one, the wilder one. It comes to us most vividly through Hesiod, the Greek poet who, writing sometime around the 8th century before the Common Era, set down in his Theogony the full genealogy of the gods. A vast, violent, intricate family tree stretching from primordial chaos all the way to the ordered world of Olympus. And in that genealogy, Aphrodite is not Zeus's daughter. She is not anyone's daughter. She is older than all of that. She belongs to an earlier age entirely, the age of the Titans, the age before the Olympian order existed, when Cronus castrated Uranos and cast the divine flesh into the sea. The ocean churned around it for a long time. The ancient sources speak of a white foam spreading outward from the wound, luminous and restless, moving across the surface of the water with a kind of impossible stillness at its center. And then, rising from within that foam, she came. The Greeks called her, in this telling, Urania, the heavenly one, the one born of sky and sea, of violence transformed into beauty, of the oldest pain in the universe becoming something luminous. She drifted, according to some accounts, first toward the island of Cythera and then on to Cyprus. And it was Cyprus that claimed her most deeply, the island that would remain, for centuries, the most sacred place in her world. The island where her greatest temples would be built. The island where pilgrims would walk barefoot to her shrines, leaving behind offerings of flowers and fruit and small clay figures shaped in her likeness. When she came ashore, the Hours, goddesses of the seasons, were waiting for her. They clothed her, adorned her, led her up to Olympus. And Olympus, for perhaps the only time in its long and turbulent history, greeted a newcomer with unanimous wonder. This version of Aphrodite, the foam-born, the ancient, the one who preceded the Olympian order, carries with it a particular weight. She is not a creation of Zeus's world. She pre-exists it. She is, in a very real sense, older than the gods themselves. The second origin story is the quieter one, the more domesticated one, you might say. It comes from Homer, writing in approximately the same era as Hesiod, and it tells a very different tale. In this version, Aphrodite is the daughter of Zeus and an ocean nymph named Dione, a figure so obscure that she barely appears anywhere else in Greek mythology, as though she existed for no other purpose than to explain this one birth. In the Homeric version, Aphrodite is an Olympian by blood and by right. She has a father, she has a mother. She was born in the ordinary divine fashion and took her place among the 12 gods of Olympus, as one takes a seat at a table that already has one's name upon it. This version is sometimes called the lesser origin, the rationalized one, the one that later Greeks, who were perhaps more comfortable with a tidy divine family tree, preferred to reach for when they needed Aphrodite to fit neatly into the Olympian order. But it would be a mistake to dismiss it too quickly. Because the Homeric Aphrodite, Zeus's daughter, Olympian by lineage, is in some ways a more complex figure than her foam-born counterpart. She is embedded in the politics and relationships of Olympus. She has a father who both indulges and is frustrated by her. She has a husband she does not particularly want. She has lovers, feuds, alliances, wounded pride. She is, in the Homeric telling, a personality as much as a force. And personalities make for better stories. The philosopher Plato, writing several centuries later, found this division so significant that he used it as the basis for one of his most elegant ideas. In his Symposium, that extraordinary dialogue on the nature of love, Plato's character, Pausanias, argues that the two Aphrodites represent two entirely different kinds of love. The heavenly Aphrodite, the ancient one born of sky and sea, represents a love that is noble, elevated, concerned with the soul rather than the body, a love that seeks wisdom, virtue, and lasting connection. The kind of love that, as Pausanias puts it, genuinely improves the person who feels it. The common Aphrodite, Zeus's daughter, the Olympian one, represents something earthier, more immediate, more concerned with pleasure and the body, with desire as appetite rather than devotion. Plato, being Plato, had a clear preference. But the remarkable thing is that he did not suggest the second kind of love was false or worthless, only that it needed to be understood for what it was. And in that, he was being faithful to something the Greeks had always known about Aphrodite, that she contained multitudes, that she was not one thing, that the same goddess who inspired the deepest and most transcendent human devotion was also the one who sent people spiraling into obsession, recklessness, and ruin, and that this was not a contradiction. This was, in fact, exactly the point. What does it mean, though, that she was born from violence? This is the question that sits quietly at the center of her oldest origin story, and it deserves to be held for a moment rather than simply moved past. The act that created her was not a loving one. It was not gentle. It was not the kind of event from which one would expect beauty to emerge. It was a wound. It was a rupture. It was the most primal act of destruction in the entire mythological record. A son overthrowing his father, an old order ending in blood and salt water. And from that, specifically from that, came the goddess of love. The ancient Greeks were not naive about what this meant. They were not suggesting that love is violent exactly, though they were certainly aware that it can be. They were saying something subtler, something closer to the truth of lived experience. They were saying that beauty and desire do not arise from comfortable places. They arise from the wound in things, from the gap between what is and what is longed for, from the place where something has been broken open and the sea has rushed in. Aphrodite does not come to people in moments of perfect contentment. She comes in moments of longing, in the ache of absence, in the recognition, sudden, inexplicable, sometimes unwelcome, that something or someone has become necessary to you. She rises, as she always has, from the foam. There is one more thing worth noting about these two origin stories, and it is perhaps the most quietly extraordinary detail of all. In the older telling, the Hesiodic one, Aphrodite is accompanied from the very beginning by two figures who never leave her side. Their names are Eros and Himeros, desire and longing, not as separate gods who happen to be her companions, but as presences that arose with her, that are intrinsic to her very nature. She does not bring desire into the world. She is inseparable from it. Desire is not something she wields. It is something she is made of. And Himeros, longing, is perhaps even more interesting, because longing is desire's quieter, more melancholy twin. It is desire in the presence of distance, want without the ability to reach, the ache for something that is there but not yet, or there but not yours, or there once and now gone. That the Greeks bound longing so deeply to their goddess of love tells us something profound about how they understood the experience of loving. They did not imagine it as a state of arrival. They imagined it as a state of reaching, always reaching. Even at its most fulfilled, love carries within it the shadow of its own potential loss. That is what Aphrodite contains. That is what she governs. Not just the golden, sun-warmed surface of desire, but the deep and restless current that runs beneath it. The longing that never fully quiets, even when everything is well. Even when the beloved is right beside you. Even when the flowers are blooming in her footsteps and the birds have begun, once more, to sing. If the Greeks wanted to understand a god, they told stories about who that god loved. It was their most reliable method, more revealing than any list of attributes, more illuminating than any temple inscription, because who you love, and how you love, and what you are willing to do in the name of love. These things, the Greeks believed, tell the whole truth about a person, even if that person happens to be immortal. And so, when we want to understand Aphrodite fully, not just as a concept, not just as a force of nature rising from the sea, but as a personality, a presence, a being with desires and loyalties and wounds of her own, we follow her into her relationships. What we find there is not what you might expect. What we find is a goddess who was, in almost every dimension of her intimate life, deeply and deliberately out of place, badly matched, constrained by arrangements she did not choose, reaching, always, for something the official version of her life could not give her, which is to say, she was extraordinarily human. Her husband was Hephaestus. Let that sit for a moment. The goddess of beauty and desire, the most luminous being in all of creation, was married to the god of the forge, the smith god, the one who spent his days underground, surrounded by fire and iron, his face and arms darkened with soot, his body, in most tellings, lame from a fall he had taken in childhood, or perhaps from having been thrown from Olympus entirely, depending on which version of that story you follow. The marriage was, by any measure, a mismatch so extreme it borders on the absurd. And the Greeks knew this. They intended it, because the story of Aphrodite and Hephaestus is not a love story. It is a story about power and ownership, and what happens when the most beautiful thing in existence is handed to someone as a prize. The origins of the match differ across sources, but the most common telling goes like this. Hephaestus, having been thrown from Olympus by his own mother Hera, exacted a subtle and elegant revenge. He built her a golden throne so beautiful she could not resist sitting in it, and then he enchanted it so that she could not rise from it. Olympus was thrown into chaos. The gods pleaded and bargained, and Hephaestus, from his forge far below, simply waited. The offer that finally brought him back to Olympus, the offer that released Hera from her golden trap, was Aphrodite. She was the price. She was the negotiation. And no one, in any version of this story that survives, records that anyone thought to ask her opinion on the matter. This is not a small detail. This is, in fact, the entire context for everything that follows. Aphrodite did not love Hephaestus. She respected, perhaps, his extraordinary skill. He was, without question, the greatest craftsman in all of existence, divine or mortal. She appreciated the gifts he made for her, jeweled girdles, golden ornaments, objects of such beauty that even she was moved by them. But appreciation is not desire, and Aphrodite, of all beings, understood the difference absolutely. Her heart, from very early in the marriage, belonged elsewhere. It belonged to Ares. If Hephaestus was everything, Aphrodite was not. Earthbound, unglamorous, patient, methodical. Then Ares was, on the surface, everything she was. He was radiant with a dangerous kind of beauty. He was passionate, impulsive, overwhelming in his presence. He was the god of war, and there was something in that, in the pure and reckless energy of him, in the way he moved through the world, as though consequence was someone else's concern, that Aphrodite found irresistible. Their affair was one of the worst-kept secrets on Olympus. It was the sun god Helios who finally brought it into the open. Helios, who saw everything from his chariot in the sky, watched the two of them slip away together and carried the information directly to Hephaestus. And Hephaestus, who was hurt and humiliated, and also, crucially, the cleverest craftsman who had ever lived, set to work. He forged a net, not a net you could see, but one so fine it was invisible, made of links so small they could not be detected by touch. He spread it over the bed where Aphrodite and Ares were accustomed to meet, and then he announced, loudly, that he was leaving for a trip to the island of Lemnos. They came together. The net fell, and there they were, caught. The god of war and the goddess of love, suddenly unable to move, tangled in bronze, so delicate it was invisible, and so strong it held even divine bodies without effort. And then Hephaestus, rather than handle this quietly, invited every god on Olympus to come and look. They came. Of course they came, and the reaction was precisely what you might expect from a gathering of immortals who had been watching this particular drama unfold for years. The goddesses declined to attend, out of what Homer describes as something like propriety, but the male gods came, and they laughed. That great, uncontrollable, divine laughter that rings through the pages of the Odyssey like something both embarrassing and impossible to suppress. It was Hermes who said the most honest thing. Apollo, looking at the ensnared Ares, asked whether Hermes would accept this humiliation in exchange for lying beside golden Aphrodite, and Hermes, without hesitation, said yes. He would accept chains 3 times as strong, and the laughter of every god and goddess in existence for that. Even in captivity, even publicly shamed, even in the worst possible circumstances, she was still Aphrodite. Ares was not her only lover. He was simply the most famous, the most enduring, and the one whose story was told with the greatest relish. There was also Adonis. Adonis was mortal, or very nearly so, and the story of how he came into the world is itself a dark and tangled thing, born of a curse and a transformation that we need not detail fully here. What matters is what he became, perhaps the most beautiful young man who ever lived, and the one who, more than any other figure in her long divine life, Aphrodite loved with something that looked, from the outside, like vulnerability. She loved him in the way that mortals love, with urgency and worry, and the particular tenderness that comes from knowing the beloved is fragile. She followed him when he hunted. She warned him, repeatedly, to avoid the animals that could destroy him. the boar above all others, with its terrible strength and its low, raking tusks. He did not listen. Beautiful young men, in Greek mythology, almost never do. He was killed on a hillside, hunting, a boar's tusk finding the soft place where his thigh met his body. And Aphrodite, who felt it happen, who felt the thread of his life simply stop, the way you feel. A sound cease without knowing exactly when the silence began, flew to him, and found him already gone. What she did next is one of the most quietly poignant things in all of Greek mythology. She wept. The goddess of love, the most powerful emotional force in the universe, simply knelt in the grass and wept over a dead young man and could not save him, because some things are beyond even her. And from her tears and from his blood, flowers grew. The Greeks called them anemones, wind flowers, because they bloom in spring and the wind strips their petals almost immediately. A flower that arrives beautiful and departs before you are ready. If ever a myth encoded a feeling perfectly, it is that one. There were others. Anchises, a Trojan shepherd of noble blood, with whom Aphrodite conceived a son. Aeneas, who would one day carry the story of Troy into a new world and, through the long unspooling of history, become the mythological ancestor of Rome itself. Aphrodite's love, in this case, extended across centuries, shaping the destiny of an entire civilization through a single night on a mountainside in Asia Minor. There was Phaon, the ferryman made young and beautiful by her grace, whose story tangled in later tradition with the legend of the poet Sappho. There were others, mortal and divine, whose names the ancient sources passed through quickly, like a list of places visited on a long and winding road. But the pattern, across all of them, is consistent and worth naming. Aphrodite loved in ways that were total. She did not offer affection carefully, in measured portions, with one eye on propriety and one on consequence. She loved the way her own power worked, completely, immediately, and with an indifference to the disruption it caused. And she was, for all her power, repeatedly heartbroken by Ares, who was fundamentally incapable of the constancy she seemed, despite everything, to want. By Adonis, who was taken from her by the ordinary cruelty of the world, by the conditions of her own existence, a being of infinite capacity for love, bound by marriage to a man she did not choose and orbiting, for eternity, a longing she could never quite bring to rest. She was the goddess of desire, yes, but she was also, in ways the Greeks understood better than we sometimes give them credit for, the goddess of desire's opposite side, the side that sits in the dark long after the other person has gone to sleep, and feels the distance, and does not know what to do with how much it wants. Aphrodite knew that feeling. She had known it from the beginning, from the very moment she rose from the sea with longing itself walking beside her, silent and faithful, and impossible to leave behind. There is a moment, somewhere in the deep prehistory of Greek myth, before the ships were launched, and the walls of Troy were standing, and the greatest war in the ancient world had begun. A moment so small, so apparently trivial, that it is almost comic in its modesty. A golden apple, a wedding party, three goddesses who could not agree. From that moment, everything unraveled. And Aphrodite was at the center of it, not as a bystander, not as a victim of circumstance, but as the one who, when the moment came, played her hand with such perfect and ruthless clarity that the consequences echoed across 10 years of war, the fall of an entire civilization, and centuries of literature that has never fully stopped being written. This is the story of the Judgment of Paris, and it is, in many ways, the definitive Aphrodite story, the one that shows us, more completely than any other, exactly who she was and exactly what she was capable of. It began at a wedding, the wedding of Peleus and Thetis, a mortal king and a sea nymph, was one of the great divine social occasions of the mythological age. Nearly every god and goddess of significance was invited. The celebration was held on Mount Pelion, and it was by all accounts extraordinary. Music, wine, the kind of radiant company that only assembled in the oldest stories. Nearly every god was invited. The operative word is nearly. Eris was not. Eris was the goddess of discord, not a particularly popular figure at dinner parties, for reasons that will become immediately apparent. She was excluded from the guest list deliberately, and with what must have seemed like reasonable justification at the time. One does not invite the goddess of strife to a wedding unless one is specifically hoping for strife. But Eris arrived anyway. She came to the edge of the celebration, and without entering, without speaking to anyone, without doing anything that could technically be called an act of aggression, she rolled a golden apple into the gathering. On the apple, 3 words were inscribed: for the fairest. And then she left. Her work was done. The apple came to rest, and 3 goddesses reached for it at the same moment. Hera, queen of Olympus, wife of Zeus, sovereign of marriage and power. Athena, goddess of wisdom and warfare, grey-eyed and formidable. And Aphrodite. 3 goddesses, 1 apple, and the absolute, immediate, unresolvable certainty that each of them deserved it. Zeus, with the particular wisdom of a king who knows when a problem has no safe answer, declined to judge between them. He was, after all, married to one of the claimants and father to another. Whatever he decided, he lost. He was not a fool. He redirected the contest. The judge would be a mortal, a young man from Troy, a prince in fact, though he did not yet know his own royal blood, named Paris. He was living as a shepherd on the slopes of Mount Ida, handsome and unaware that the entire future of the world was about to be handed to him for an opinion. The 3 goddesses descended from Olympus and presented themselves before him. What happened next is one of the great open questions of mythology. Whether the goddesses appeared to Paris as he would have seen ordinary women, or whether they revealed their full divine radiance, the sources do not entirely agree. What they do agree on is this: each goddess, understanding instinctively that a mortal offered a choice between 3 immortals, needed more than beauty to make a decision, offered him something. Hera offered power. Specifically, she offered him dominion over kingdoms, the capacity to rule, to command, to become the greatest king in the mortal world. It was not a small offer. It was, by any rational measurement, an extraordinary one. Athena offered wisdom and skill in battle, the guarantee that he would become the finest warrior and the most brilliant strategist who ever lived, the promise of a different kind of greatness, earned, lasting, and unassailable. And Aphrodite offered him Helen. Helen, wife of the Spartan king Menelaus. Helen, considered by universal agreement the most beautiful mortal woman alive. Helen, who was already married, already a queen, already the cornerstone of a political alliance that held the Greek world in a particular and fragile balance. Aphrodite did not mention any of those complications. She offered Helen simply and completely, as though there were no husband, no Sparta, no consequences, as though love were the only coordinate that mattered and everything else were negotiable. Paris chose Aphrodite. Now here is where we must pause, because history, or the version of history that mythology preserves, has not always been kind to Paris in the retelling of this moment. He is often portrayed as shallow, as choosing beauty over wisdom and power because he was young and vain and did not think. But this reading underestimates something important. The offer Aphrodite made was not simply an offer of a beautiful woman. It was an offer of love, real, reciprocated, overwhelming love, guaranteed by the goddess who governed it. Hera was offering power over others. Athena was offering mastery of self. Aphrodite was offering connection, the particular and terrifying intimacy of being fully known and fully wanted by another person. In a different story, That might have been the wisest choice of all. But Aphrodite, in making her offer, had done what she always did when she decided something should happen. She had simplified. She had reduced the full complexity of the situation down to a single, luminous point. And in the light of that point, everything else went dark. The husband, the war, the 1,000 ships, the 10 years, the bodies on the beach. All of it existed already as consequence. She simply chose not to illuminate it. Whether that was cruelty or simply the nature of desire itself is a question worth sitting with. Paris went to Sparta. He was received as a guest by Menelaus, treated with the full hospitality that the ancient Greek world considered sacred and inviolable. And then Menelaus left for a funeral in Crete, and Paris, guided by Aphrodite, protected by Aphrodite, arguably somewhat overtaken by Aphrodite, left with Helen. Whether Helen went willingly or was taken by force is one of the oldest arguments in classical scholarship. Homer seems to suggest she went willingly, and that she later regretted it, and that her feelings shifted and resettled across the long years of the war, like sand rearranging itself beneath moving water. Other sources are less ambiguous, less generous, less interested in her interior life. What matters for our purposes is what the departure of Helen from Sparta set in motion. Menelaus, returning from Crete to find his wife and his guest both gone, called upon his brother Agamemnon. Agamemnon called upon the kings and heroes of Greece, invoking an old oath they had all sworn, that whoever married Helen would be defended by all the others if she were ever taken. One by one, the greatest figures in the Greek world began to assemble: Achilles, Odysseus, Ajax, Diomedes. 1,000 ships gathered in the harbor at Aulis. And then they sailed for Troy. What followed was 10 years of war, so devastating, so total in its destruction, that the Greeks never stopped writing about it. It became the central event of their mythological imagination, the crucible in which the greatest heroes were tested and found, ultimately, mortal. The place where Achilles discovered the limit of his invulnerability, where Odysseus began the long journey home that would take another decade, where Hector, the greatest of the Trojan warriors, died outside the walls of his own city while his wife and child watched from above. And Aphrodite was present throughout all of it. She was not a distant cause, a goddess who had set things in motion from afar and then retired to Olympus to watch. She was actively, physically present on the battlefield, intervening, protecting, redirecting in ways that the other gods found by turns impressive and infuriating. Her most personal investment was in Paris himself, and in Aeneas, her son by the Trojan shepherd Anchises. She shielded them repeatedly. When Paris faced Menelaus in single combat, a duel that would have ended the war immediately, that should have ended it, that nearly did, and Menelaus had Paris by the helmet, dragging him toward his death, Aphrodite snapped the chinstrap. She wrapped Paris in a divine mist and carried him from the field. She deposited him, safe and bewildered, in his own bedroom, and then she went to find Helen and bring her to him. Helen's response to this intervention is one of the most remarkable moments in Homer. She was furious. She recognized the goddess, saw through the disguise Aphrodite had adopted, and refused at first to go. She said with a bitterness that is almost modern in its texture, that if Aphrodite loved Paris so much, she could go be his companion herself, that she was tired, that she was ashamed. Aphrodite's response was not gentle. She reminded Helen quietly and with absolute clarity that she was Aphrodite, that she could withdraw her favor as easily as she had given it, that the same power that had made Helen the most beautiful woman in the world, the same power that had drawn Paris to her and brought her across the sea, that power could be redirected. That love given by a goddess could also be taken away. Helen went, because this too is part of what Aphrodite governed. Not just desire, but its weaponization. Not just love, but the knowledge of what its absence would feel like, and the willingness, when necessary, to use that knowledge. There was one moment in the Trojan War, one extraordinary scene, that encapsulates perhaps better than any other the full and paradoxical nature of Aphrodite's power. The Greek hero Diomedes, one of the great warriors of the Iliad, was fighting in the thick of battle when he encountered Aeneas. Aphrodite moved to protect her son, wrapping her arms around him, and Diomedes, guided at that moment by Athena, who had no patience for Aphrodite's interference, did something no mortal had ever done. He wounded her. His spear found her wrist. Divine blood, ichor, the Greeks called it, the golden fluid that ran through immortal veins instead of red mortal blood, spilled across the battlefield. Aphrodite cried out and dropped Aeneas and fled to Olympus, weeping, seeking comfort from her mother Dione. Zeus, watching her arrive in tears, smiled, gently, affectionately, and told her that war was not her domain, that she should leave the business of battle to Athena and Ares, and concern herself with the sweeter things, the things that were truly hers. It was kindly meant. It was also, given everything we have seen, magnificently wrong, because the war itself, its origin, its persistence, its particular human texture, was entirely her domain. She had not fought it with a spear. She had created it with something far more powerful, a promise, a choice, a golden apple rolling across a marble floor. That was always her weapon, and it had always been enough. We have followed Aphrodite through her origins and her loves. We have watched her move through the great catastrophe of Troy, seen her wound and be wounded, seen her reduce kings and heroes to instruments of a desire they did not choose and could not govern. We have seen the darker architecture of her power. Now we turn to something quieter, something that requires a different kind of attention. We turn to the people, because for all the grandeur of mythology, for all the divine dramas played out on Olympus and the plains of Troy, Aphrodite was not only a figure in stories, she was a living, breathing presence in the daily lives of millions of people across centuries. She was prayed to, petitioned, feared, thanked, and negotiated with by farmers and sailors and merchants and mothers and young people on the edge of their first love who did not know what was happening to them and desperately needed someone to ask. She was worshipped, deeply, widely, and with a richness of ritual that tells us, more honestly than any myth, what she actually meant to the people who built their lives in her world. And what she meant was enormous. The earliest evidence of her worship does not begin in Greece at all. This is something scholars have understood for well over a century, but that tends to surprise people when they first encounter it. Aphrodite, that most Greek of goddesses, appears to have roots that stretch far beyond the Greek world, east and south, into the ancient civilizations of the Near East, into traditions that preceded Homer and Hesiod by thousands of years. Her closest ancient relative was Ishtar, the great goddess of the Babylonians, a deity of love, desire, fertility, and war, worshipped across Mesopotamia with an intensity and longevity that made her one of the most significant divine figures of the ancient world. Before Ishtar, there was Inanna, her Sumerian predecessor, whose myths are among the oldest written stories in human history. And then there was Astarte, the Phoenician goddess, worshipped across the eastern Mediterranean, carried by Phoenician traders along their extraordinary network of sea routes to Cyprus, to Crete, to the islands that would become the heart of the Greek world. Cyprus, that island where Aphrodite came ashore in her oldest myth, was a crossroads, a place where the cultures of the Near East and the emerging world of Greece met, traded, intermarried, and exchanged ideas. It was there, most scholars now believe, that the Eastern goddess and the Greek mythological imagination found each other, that Astarte, carried west by Phoenician sailors, was received by a people who already had their own intimations of such a power, and over generations became something new, became Aphrodite, wearing Greek clothes, speaking Greek names, embedded in Greek stories, but carrying within her the deep memory of a tradition far older than Greece itself. This is why she feels, in the oldest accounts, slightly different from the other Olympians, slightly stranger, slightly more fundamental. Because she arrives in Greek mythology, carrying the weight of civilizations that came before it, and the Greeks, perhaps without fully knowing why, sensed the depth in her and treated her accordingly. Her most sacred island was Cyprus. This was consistent, unwavering, across all centuries of her worship. The city of Paphos, on the southwestern coast, was considered the site of her landing, the place where the sea foam had finally released her, and the hours had come to clothe her. And it was at Paphos that her greatest temple was built. The sanctuary at Paphos was not like other Greek temples. Most Greek temples housed a statue of the deity, a sculpted image, usually of great beauty, that served as the focal point of worship. The temple at Paphos contained something different. At its center, in the innermost sacred space, stood a conical stone, roughly shaped, uncarved, ancient beyond memory. A stone that predated the Greek tradition of divine portraiture entirely, that belonged to an older mode of worship, a more abstract understanding of divine presence. The goddess not as a human figure, but as a force, a presence, an energy that could inhabit a stone as easily as a statue, that did not need to be given a face to be real. Pilgrims came to Paphos from across the Mediterranean world. They came on foot and by sea, sometimes from extraordinary distances, to stand before that ancient stone and make their offerings. Flowers, predominantly. Fruit. Incense. Small clay figures shaped in the forms of the things they were asking for. A healthy child, a prosperous marriage, a love returned. The temple survived, in various forms, for over 1,000 years. That is not an accident. That is the measure of how much she was needed. Her worship spread across the Greek world in ways that reflected her enormous range of meaning. At Corinth, a wealthy and cosmopolitan city where trade routes converged, her temple on the Acrocorinth was one of the most significant sanctuaries in Greece. Corinth's position as a crossroads city, between East and West, between cultures, between peoples, made it a natural home for a goddess whose origins were themselves a kind of crossroads. The worship at Corinth had, by many ancient accounts, a quality that was more openly sensual than at other sites, more willing to inhabit the earthier dimensions of Aphrodite's domain. The later Roman writer Strabo described the temple's sacred establishment with a vividness that subsequent scholars have debated extensively. But what is clear is that Corinth's Aphrodite was worshipped with a fullness, a completeness, that refused to separate her role as goddess of love from her role as goddess of desire. She was both, and at Corinth, people seemed particularly unwilling to pretend otherwise. At Athens, where Athena's shadow fell long and cool across the religious landscape, Aphrodite was worshipped in the area of the Agora and near the Acropolis with a somewhat different emphasis, more civic, more concerned with the bonds of affection that held communities together, with the harmonizing power of love as a social force. The Athenians called one aspect of her Aphrodite Pandemos, Aphrodite of all the people, the version of her power that knit human society into something more than a collection of competing individuals. This was the civic Aphrodite, the goddess whose domain included not just romantic desire, but the whole spectrum of human attachment. At Sparta, where the culture was militaristic and austere in ways that might seem inhospitable to a goddess of beauty and pleasure, Aphrodite was worshipped nonetheless. And worshipped, intriguingly, in a form that acknowledged her connection to warfare. The Spartans seem to have honored what the rest of Greece sometimes preferred to look away from, that love and war were not opposites, but intimates, that the same force that drove people toward each other could, when thwarted or weaponized, drive them to destruction. Their Aphrodite was sometimes depicted armed, a goddess of desire who also understood conflict, in whose worship the two great energies of human life were not separated, but held together in one figure. The festivals held in her honor were numerous and varied, but perhaps the most widely observed were the Aphrodisia, celebrations held across the Greek world, usually in midsummer, when the heat itself seemed to carry her presence in it. The Aphrodisia were not solemn occasions. They were joyful ones, characterized by processions and music, by the wearing of garlands and the burning of incense, by gatherings that combined the sacred and the celebratory in the way that ancient Greek religion at its best managed to do, understanding that joy was not a diminishment of reverence but one of its highest expressions. Doves were sacred to her, doves and sparrows, both of which appear in the oldest descriptions of her retinue, and both of which were released at festivals in her honor, rising from temple precincts into the Mediterranean sky, in clouds of gray and white, while the people below watched and felt, or tried to feel, the presence of the goddess in the movement of wings. Roses were hers. The myrtle tree was hers, an evergreen shrub whose small white flowers carry a fragrance that the Greeks associated specifically with her, and which was woven into the garlands worn at her festivals and at weddings. Apples, in some traditions, were sacred to her, pomegranates, the quince. The objects of her world, taken together, form a portrait of a goddess whose domain was abundance, fruit and flower and bird and fragrance. The sensory richness of the living world offered back to the force that was understood to animate it. She was petitioned for very specific things, and the votive offerings left at her shrines tell us what those things were with extraordinary directness. Young women asked for good marriages, not just for love in the abstract, but for the concrete, practical, daily reality of a good match. A husband who would be kind, a household that would be stable, children who would be healthy. These were not small requests. In the ancient world, a woman's marriage was the central structuring fact of her entire life, and Aphrodite was the divine figure to whom that fact was entrusted. Young men asked for favor in their pursuit of love. Sailors asked for safe passage. Aphrodite had a maritime aspect, born as she was from the sea, and was considered a protector of those who crossed open water. Merchants asked for the kind of goodwill and charm that made transactions go smoothly, that made strangers trust each other, that greased the social mechanisms of commerce with something more human than calculation. Even soldiers, even warriors, asked her for things, not for victory in battle, that was Ares and Athena's territory, but for the things that war threatens most directly, the survival of loved ones, the return home, the possibility, after the violence, of ordinary life resuming, of someone being there when you came back. She was asked, in other words, for everything that makes human life feel worth living. There is one more dimension of her worship that deserves to be spoken of carefully, because it is the one most likely to be misunderstood across the distance of 2,500 years. Aphrodite was a goddess of the body. Explicitly, unapologetically, and in ways that the Greek world did not find troubling in the way that later traditions sometimes would. The body's capacity for pleasure, for beauty, for connection. These were not things to be overcome or transcended in her worship. They were the point. They were the very substance of what she governed, and honoring her meant, in some genuine and direct sense, honoring the body's own experience of being alive. This is worth pausing on, because there is a tendency, in retrospect, to either sanitize ancient religion into something bloodless and philosophical, or to sensationalize it into something prurient and scandalous. The reality was neither. It was a culture that had not yet learned to separate the sacred from the physical, that understood the experience of desire, that overwhelming, disorienting, humbling rush of wanting, as something divine in itself, as evidence of a goddess at work, as proof that you were alive in a world that had been arranged somehow for this. The worship of Aphrodite was, at its core, a practice of attention to beauty wherever it appeared, attention to the movement of feeling inside you, attention to the connections between people, their tenderness, their longing, their extraordinary and irrational willingness to become necessary to one another. She was worshipped because she was needed, and she was needed because what she governed, love, in its full and unruly complexity, was the thing the Greeks, like all people everywhere, most wanted to understand and could never quite manage to. The temples rose, the doves were released, the myrtle garlands were woven, the offerings were left, and somewhere in the sound of the sea, in the warmth of a Mediterranean afternoon, in the way two people turned toward each other across a room without quite knowing why, she was there. She was always there. Every civilization that has ever existed has had a version of her. That is not a poetic exaggeration. It is one of the most consistent and verifiable facts in the entire study of human culture, across every continent, in every era for which we have sufficient records, in societies that had no contact with Greece and no knowledge of the Olympian pantheon. There is a goddess, or a spirit, or a divine principle, whose domain is love and beauty and desire, whose power is understood to be fundamental, whose worship is considered not optional but necessary. The Egyptians had Hathor, the Mesopotamians had Inanna and Ishtar, the Hindus had Rasi and Kamadeva, the Norse had Freyja, the Romans, who absorbed Greek religion with the systematic thoroughness that characterized everything they did, took Aphrodite and gave her a new name and a new set of stories and built her the most enduring cultural legacy she has ever had. They called her Venus. The Roman adoption of Aphrodite was not simple translation. It never is when one culture absorbs another's gods. Something always shifts. Something always gets emphasized that was previously quiet, or quieted that was previously loud. Venus inherited everything that Aphrodite was: the beauty, the desire, the maritime origins, the power over mortal and immortal hearts alike. But she also became something Aphrodite had only partially been: a founding goddess, a divine ancestor of Rome itself, through Aeneas, Aphrodite's son, the Trojan hero who escaped the fall of Troy and carried his people westward across the Mediterranean. Venus became the divine mother of the Roman people. Julius Caesar claimed her as his personal divine ancestor. Augustus, the first emperor, built her one of the most magnificent temples in Rome. The poet Virgil opened his great epic, the Aeneid, with an invocation of her favor, placing her at the very beginning of the story of Rome's origins, as though nothing that followed could be understood without first acknowledging her. She became, in the Roman imagination, not just a goddess of love, but a goddess of destiny, of the force that pulls history in particular directions, of the invisible current beneath events that carries civilizations toward their appointed ends. Aphrodite, the sea-born, the ancient, the one who arrived before the gods had names, she had become the mother of an empire. When Christianity spread through the Roman world and the old gods began to recede, Aphrodite and Venus did not disappear. They went underground. They transformed. They found new shapes in which to persist. Some scholars have noted the striking similarities between the iconography of Aphrodite, the goddess with the child Eros, represented in art as a mother cradling her son, and the emerging iconography of the Virgin Mary. This is not an argument for identity between the two figures, and it is not a suggestion that Christian theology absorbed pagan religion deliberately. It is simply an observation about how deeply the human need for a feminine divine presence runs, and how persistent that need is across the apparent boundaries of religious change. The great medieval cathedrals of Europe were built, in many cases, on or near sites that had previously been sacred to earlier traditions that, in the Mediterranean world, often had some relationship to the goddess of love and beauty. The human impulse to mark certain places as sacred, to bring offerings, to ask for help with the most intimate and urgent concerns of life. That impulse did not end with the old gods. It simply reorganized itself. And Aphrodite, goddess of adaptation as much as desire, moved with it. The Renaissance found her again, when European artists and scholars, beginning in 15th century Italy, turned back to the classical world with a new intensity of interest and admiration. They found in Aphrodite and Venus a figure who seemed to crystallize everything they were reaching for, the union of beauty and meaning, of the physical and the transcendent, of the human body as something worthy of reverence rather than suspicion. Sandra Botticelli painted her rising from the sea, standing on her shell, the wind goddess breathing her hair sideways, the hours waiting on the shore with a flowered cloak. The image became one of the most recognized paintings in the history of Western art, not because it is sensational, not because it shocks, but because it captures something that feels, even now, true. A figure of extraordinary presence arriving into the world, the sea still in her hair, the shore still uncertain beneath her feet, the expression on her face neither triumphant nor afraid, but simply present, already sovereign. Titian painted her. Raphael painted her. Later, Velázquez, Rubens, Ingres, the sculptors of the ancient world had already given us the Venus de Milo, the Capitoline Venus, the Venus of Arles, figures so perfectly resolved that generations of artists used them as the definition of what beauty, rendered in stone, could be. She gave art, across centuries, its most enduring subject. The human form, apprehended as something sacred. The body not as obstacle, but as revelation. And then there is the language she left behind. The word venereal carries her Roman name in it, a reminder that desire has always been understood, even in its medical dimensions, as something divine in origin and complex in consequence. The word venerate comes from the same root, to hold in deep reverence, to treat as sacred. The planet Venus, the brightest object in the night sky after the moon, was named for her because the ancients associated its luminosity with her nature, the thing that outshines everything around it without apparent effort, simply by being what it is. The month of April was, in Roman tradition, sacred to Venus. The word aphrodisiac carries her name directly, a substance that awakens desire, that moves the body toward wanting. Even the word amorous, passing through Latin and French and into English, traces its lineage back to the same root that produced amor, the Roman name for Eros, her son, her companion, her most faithful attribute. She is in the language we use without thinking, in the calendar we follow, in the sky we look up at on clear evenings when the first star appears before dark has fully fallen, and someone, somewhere, makes a wish. What do we do with her then? We who live 2,500 years after the last of her temples fell quiet in a world that has replaced most of her explicit worship with other frameworks and other explanations. Perhaps we do what the Greeks did, without quite knowing it. Perhaps we honor her not in temples, but in the attention we pay to beauty when it stops us, in the helplessness we feel when desire arrives uninvited and rearranges our priorities without asking permission, in the grief that follows love lost, which is only possible because the love was real, which is only possible because something in us was open to it. The Greeks built temples because they understood that the forces governing human life were larger than human life, that desire and love and beauty and longing, these were not simply personal experiences. They were encounters with something that preceded you and would outlast you, something that moved through you the way the sea moves through the foam it produces, briefly and completely, before moving on to the next wave. Aphrodite was their way of naming that something. of giving it a face, a story, a set of relationships that made it comprehensible, or at least narratable, of saying, this overwhelming thing that happens to you, this thing that makes you foolish and courageous and tender and reckless and more alive than you have felt in years, it is real. It is ancient. It is larger than you, and you are not alone in it. That is what gods are for. That is what she was for. And if you have ever stood in the particular stillness that follows falling in love, that moment of quiet astonishment before the complexity arrives, when the world simply looks different and you cannot explain why, then you have stood, however briefly, in her light. She was always there. She is the foam on the water. She is the ache before the word for it exists. She is the flower that blooms in the footstep and the wind that takes the petals before you are ready. She was Aphrodite, and the sea has never stopped producing her.